The Drunken Botanist came from a convention of horticulture writers. Actually, here in Portland, Oregon, where I live right now, I didn't live here at the time, but we were all in town, and I went on a liquor run with another writer who's an expert in agaves. And we just ran down the street to a liquor store, and we're walking around looking for whatever we're looking for. And I saw the tequila section, and I said, "Oh, look, here's all your agaves." And then I just started naming the plants in all the other bottles, right? Like for the rum, there's the sugar cane, and here's the grapes, and here's the apples, and I just started doing that. And I was like, wow, if you look around here, there's actually nothing but plants in all of these bottles. Like that's all they are plants. And I was like, somebody should write a book about that. And so that ended up being me. In no way did I think it was going to be my most popular book. It was actually sort of an idea I just had in my back pocket. It wasn't really even what I wanted to do next. It kind of turned into one of those like, well, I also had this other idea to do this thing about plants and booze. I guess we could do that, like it was that book. But yeah, you're right. It went on to become my biggest book yet. So what I did with this book, the first thing I did is I got on a plane and I went down to New Orleans for Tales of the Cocktail, which is an annual industry event for distillers and mixologists. And they put on seminars, and it can be a seminar on the history of rum or whatever. And so I would sit in these seminars, and I realized these people are extremely interested in the botanical details of every one of these plants that are ingredients in what they work with, but they don't know anything about botany. And they got so many things wrong. I was just sit there and go, oh, sweetheart, no, that is not what that species is. That's not how this works, whatever. So I understood what it was that they wanted. And I knew that I knew how to get in touch with botanists who could set the record straight. So, for instance, gentian root is the root of a flowering plant that grows. Well, there's a bunch of different ones all over the world, but the important one grows like in Switzerland in the mountains. It's sort of an alpine plant, and the root is very bitter, and it's what gives that kind of bitter orange peel flavor to Campari. What you're really tasting is gentian there, and it's in a lot of Amari and aperitif and bitters. So I found the botanist who's sort of the leading expert in gentian. She's at Rutgers. She was very happy to talk to me. She's also interested in like all the different herbal concoctions that are made out of the plant, but her research goes well beyond that. And so to be able to make that bridge between botany and mixology, like that's what was missing. And so, yes, in almost every case, I was able to go debunk something. And in fact, one of the frustrating things about that book is that I would spend days and days chasing down what I was pretty sure was a myth that was circulating in the booze world. And so then I would find out that it wasn't true. And then it's like, well, so it's not true, so it's not going in my book. And so there are places in the book where I actually say, people believe the da-da-da, but that's not true. And here's what it actually is. And sometimes my editor would want to cross those paragraphs out. And I was like, no. Like, this is going to stop. I am going to set the record straight on this, and people are going to be very happy to hear about it. So I thought that there was no field that had more myths and just nonsense in it than botany, but then I got into researching booze, and I found out like that's where all the lies and nonsense it really is. So the mixture of those two, like there was a lot of setting the record straight that I did. So this is a book that I self-published. It's only available as an ebook, and I wrote it as a lark. So see, this is actually the novel I wanted to publish instead of Drunken Botanist. So, right. So before I wrote Drunken Botanist, I wrote this novel very quickly in the space of about 3 months, and then sent it off to my editor who wanted nothing to do with it. But what had happened is that my husband and I had bought a bookstore. My husband's a rare book dealer, and we bought Eureka Books in Eureka, California. And it was our first month or two to own the store. It was the middle of winter. We're both sitting around the store, and it's pouring down rain, and no customers have come in all morning. There's no money in the till. And I said something like, it feels like we're the last bookstore in America. Like it feels like we're on an island right now. Like you couldn't even see across the street. It was raining so hard. And I was like, it just feels like we're a little island floating out in the sea. And so then we, because there's nothing to do, we both start saying, well, why would there be the last bookstore in America? What would cause one bookstore to be the last one? And then what would happen? So this was right. Amazon had just introduced the Kindle. That was brand new. And I was like, well, of course, the reason is that, the Kindle killed books. It would be the reason. And but why is this one bookstore still operating? And also at the time, weed was not yet legal in California, and Humboldt County was the number one marijuana producing county in California, if not the country. So I was like, well, of course it's because they're selling weed, like the books are just a front, which is a real thing that was going on in our community. So we understood it quite well. So I sort of came up with this novel that was a little bit of a satirical / comedy about both ebooks and marijuana. And weirdly, those were not subjects my publisher was interested in touching at all. Yeah, so I really wanted to write fiction because fiction is mostly what I read for pleasure. I read nonfiction when I need to find something out, but on a vacation or on my nightstand or whatever, I'm reading novels. So I just thought, well, why am I not writing novels? So I had a few failed attempts at novels over the years. In between these nonfiction books, I would write a few chapters of a novel, try to sell it to my publisher. They would say no. Last Bookstore in America is one of those, but there were others. Uh, and then as I was writing Drunken Botanist, I wrote about a gin smuggler named Henry Kaufman. And I just wanted to find out a little bit more about him before I put him in Drunken Botanist. So I went looking and I found a lot of people named Henry Kaufman from the 1910s who got into all kinds of trouble. And one of the ones I found, almost certainly not the same guy, had a run-in with these three sisters. And after many exciting dramatic events, one of the three sisters ends up becoming a deputy sheriff, kind of as a result of this crime that was perpetrated against her and her family. And it was one of those days. I'm doing research for the Drunken Botanist. I find this newspaper article and I'm like, well, that's interesting, but I can't slow down. I need to move on. And usually I would just hit print and send those things to the printer and save them for later. But in this case, I couldn't let go of it. And so by the time Scott came home from the bookstore, in those days, it was always like, what plant did you work on today? Because I was always onto a different plant with Drunken Botanist. And I'm like, no plants today, but you're not going to believe this. And I had a whole office covered in newspaper articles that I'm like, this is an insane story. It's incredible. And he said, we have an ancestry.com account with the store. You can look at their family tree. And then I started building out their family tree. I just got very obsessed with them, and especially the fact that no one knew anything about them. Constance did these incredible things in her lifetime, and she's been completely forgotten. She's been overlooked in the literature on women in law enforcement. No one knows anything about them. And I started to feel responsible to them. Like I felt like, anyone could have found you, but I'm the one who found you. And I owe it to you to tell your story. I only have one letter, which a family member was kind enough to send me a scan of. So there is one letter. So I can see her handwriting and I can see her writing in her own words. And it was about the case. So that's helpful. Mostly what I have is newspaper coverage. And fortunately, the 1910s and 1920s are such a rich time to do research because everything was in the paper. If you went on vacation for 2 weeks, that would be in the paper that you were off visiting your family in the Poconos or whatever. So yeah, but I have lots of quotes from her and photographs that would show up in the paper. So what I did with this book, the first thing I did is I got on a plane and I went down to New Orleans for Tales of the Cocktail, which is an annual industry event for distillers and mixologists. And they put on seminars, and it can be a seminar on the history of rum or whatever. And so I would sit in these seminars and I realized these people are extremely interested in the botanical details of every one of these plants that are ingredients in what they work with. but they don't know anything about botany. And they got so many things wrong. I was just sit there and go, oh, sweetheart, no, that is not what that species is. That's not how this works, whatever. So I understood what it was that they wanted. And I knew that I knew how to get in touch with botanists who could set the record straight. So, for instance, gentian root is the root of a flowering plant that grows. Well, there's a bunch of different ones all over the world, but the important one grows like in Switzerland in the mountains. It's sort of an alpine plant, and the root is very bitter, and it's what gives that kind of bitter orange peel flavor to Campari. What you're really tasting is gentian there, and it's in a lot of amari and aperitif and bitters. So I found the botanist who's sort of the leading expert in gentian. She's at Rutgers. She was very happy to talk to me. She's also interested in like all the different herbal concoctions that are made out of the plant, but her research goes well beyond that. And so to be able to make that bridge between botany and mixology, like that's what was missing. And so, yes, in almost every case, I was able to go debunk something. And in fact, one of the frustrating things about that book is that I would spend days and days chasing down what I was pretty sure was a myth that was circulating in the booze world. And so then I would find out that it wasn't true. And then it's like, well, so it's not true, so it's not going in my book. And so there are places in the book where I actually say, you know, people believe the da-da-da, but that's not true. And here's what it actually is. And sometimes my editor would want to cross those paragraphs out. And I was like, no. Like, this is going to stop. I am going to set the record straight on this, and people are going to be very happy to hear about it. So I thought that there was no field that had more myths and just nonsense in it than botany, but then I got into researching booze and I found out like that's where all the lies and nonsense it really is. So the mixture of those two, like there was a lot of setting the record straight that I did. What happened for me was I took a year or two off during COVID. I just decided I'm not going to work. I'm not going to try to think of another book idea. I'm just going to entertain myself for a couple of years. I called myself the Amy Stewart Entertainment Committee. And every day I would just get up and try to do whatever I thought would be most entertaining that day, which involved making a lot of art. So I'd always been a painter. I've been painting in oils since I was about 30, but I got into more works on paper, like watercolor, ink, gouache, and those are classic book illustrator mediums. So it got me thinking about maybe the possibility of illustrating a book of my own. But then I had to ask myself, well, what book? Like what kind of illustrated book would I even do? And I started going back through all my rejected book ideas, of which there are many. And one of them was this idea I'd had about 10 years prior. I had met a guy who told me that he was a tree collector. And I was like, well, trees are a weird thing to collect because like they're really big and they're hard to move. And what do you even mean? What's a tree collector? What makes you a tree collector? And over the years, every few years, I would meet another person who said they were a tree collector. So I had this kind of in the back of my mind. But then and I guess it was in 2020, I had a painting for sale on my website of some palm trees in San Diego. And somebody bought the painting and I shipped it off to him. And I included a note about where I'd been in San Diego. And he wrote me right back and said, oh, I know exactly where you were. He said, my husband is a palm tree collector, only we live in Boise and they can't survive the winter there. So we have to wrap them up in foil blankets and Christmas tree lights to get them through the winter. And it looks like an amateur sci-fi movie in our backyard. And I was like, okay, that is hilarious. I think I have to do this book. So really, the idea for the tree collectors kind of came out of me casting about for like, what's a cool book I could do that I would also illustrate? And it just made sense. Like I just felt like the illustrations would help to breathe a little life into the book. And I knew it would be these little vignettes, little stories about each person, what they collect, why. What I expected was that I was going to be talking to people about all their geeky tree stuff, like somebody who's super into oak trees, and they would tell me everything about oak trees. And then I go to the next person, it would be maple trees. And like, I thought that would be the book. What I didn't realize is that these were going to be these deeply personal stories of how people's lives have been changed through their relationship with trees. And I think part of the reason the stories got so personal is that we were all kind of locked up inside. I was talking to people on Zoom all over the world who hadn't been out and about and out with people in the better part of a year, and we were all lonely and vulnerable, and people were willing to be vulnerable and to really tell me their most deeply held, kind of most intimate stories. So that's how the book kind of became what it is, which is much more about people and the kind of life transformations they've been through, that the trees have been a part of. And I had this idea that it should be about 50, and that was mostly just driven by basic math about book length, right? So if they're going to be 1,000 words each, and I do 50 of them, then that's 50,000 words. And I'm going to have little interstitials with more information. And you start putting a page count together, including the illustrations, and you get to a 300-page book that way. So I just kind of backed into the number by thinking about how many pages. I did all the interviews first, and I interviewed over 100 people to get to the 50 that ended up in the book. So it was a lot of work. And you know, some of these people live halfway around the world and don't speak English. So I'm hiring interpreters who come on the Zoom call and basically carry out the interview for me without turning to me to simultaneously translate, because it would slow it down too much. And we'd record the call, deal with the translation later. I would just be sitting there on the call to answer questions, but I would just be watching these two Japanese people talking to each other about cherry trees, and I have no idea what they're saying, but they're having a great time. So I did all those interviews first, and then selected the ones I really wanted to include in the book, but then they had to send me images of themselves so I could do a portrait of them, and also of their trees, because I still couldn't really travel. So the artwork was kind of came last. You know, if I couldn't get images from them, then they couldn't be in the book. But once I had the image, then I could write their chapter and do the art. And I would do them like I would for a week. I would do like, you know, sort of Monday, Tuesday would be writing the chapter. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday would be the art. Ideally, that would stay on schedule, and the next week it would be a new person. So that's 50 weeks of that once I was done with the interviews. Here, I'll just give you one that I think really illustrates how moving these conversations were. And she's not even the most exceptional one, but there's a woman in England, Marie Noelle Bouvet, is a maple tree collector. She's really into Japanese maples. And she's telling me about her Japanese maples. And then at one point she says, she's talking about how with Japanese maples, if they drop a seed and that seed germinates, the tree that comes from that seed will look wildly different from its parents, because there's a lot of genetic diversity. So it'll look much more different from its parents than you and I. You know, you and I look kind of like our parents probably, right? It's way different. So you can graft and propagate one of those seedlings and introduce a new variety of Japanese maple to the world and name it. And it's your Japanese maple that you have now sent out into the world that can only be reproduced by grafts. And she's telling me all this, and she tells me that that she, for a long time, she felt like she had this big hole in her life because she and her husband couldn't have kids. And she was carrying this grief around with her, and that the maple trees sort of helped to fill this hole that she felt she had in her life. And then she's telling me about this business with the grafting and how she wants to be able to introduce a tree. And she said, I haven't been able to give a name to a child, but I would like to give a name to a tree. And I just thought that was so beautiful and so profound. And like, what a thing to say to a complete stranger, you know, like every one of these people by the end of the call felt like they were my new best friends or my new cousins, or, you know, like I discovered some cool aunts and uncles I didn't know I had. Like, that's what this really became, which was really unexpected, and it's kind of great.